The air in the Redemption Valley Bank was thick enough to chew a stagnant cocktail of sun-baked dust, stale paper, and the cloying sweetness of the Teller's Bay rum tonic. Outside, the sweltering afternoon had beaten the town into a stupor. Dust devils like tired ghosts danced down the main street, the only things moving with any energy. Inside Chelsea, Macmillan felt a bead of sweat trace a slow path down her temple. She focused on the crisp stack of banknotes. Mr. Abernathy was counting the proceeds from her latest cattle sale. It was a good sale, enough to see the Double M Ranch through the winter, and then some. A small, unfamiliar feeling of security began to settle in her chest. The calm shattered with the violence of a dropped pane of glass. The bank's front door flew open, slamming against the interior wall with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. 3 figures filled the doorway, silhouetted against the blinding white glare of the street. They wore long dusters and masks that hid their faces, turning them into featureless specters of menace. A woman screamed. Mr. Abernathy's hands froze over the stack of money. The metallic click of a revolver's hammer being cocked echoed in the sudden dead silence. "Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt," a voice rasped, rough as gravel. The scene exploded into chaos. The shortest of the 3 men vaulted over the counter, his boots thudding on the polished wood. He swept the cash from Abernathy's counter into a burlap sack. The second man, a hulking brute, kept his pistol trained on the 2 customers cowering near the wall. But it was the third man and the leader who drew Chelsea's attention. He moved with a chilling efficiency that was different from the others. He wasn't just a thief. He was on a mission. He ignored the tellers, ignored the safe, and strode directly to the bank manager's office. Chelsea watched frozen as he kicked the door open. There were shouts, the crash of a heavy object, and then he reappeared. In his gloved hand, he held not a bag of money, but a small, ornate silver frame. Chelsea's breath caught in her throat. She knew that frame. It held a photograph of her parents, Thomas and Mary Macmillan, a picture taken on their 20th wedding anniversary. It had hung on Mr. Abernathy's wall for years, a testament to her father's long-standing friendship with the bank manager. As the leader moved back toward the door, his eyes cold and dark above his bandana swept the room. They landed on Chelsea's purse, sitting on the small table where she'd been signing the sale documents. With 2 long strides, he was there. He didn't snatch the whole purse. He opened it, his movements precise, and plucked out the one thing of value inside, not her emergency money, but her father's gold pocket watch, its chain spilling like liquid sunlight over his dirty glove. He paused for a fraction of a second, his gaze meeting hers. There was no recognition in his eyes, only a chilling, deliberate intent. Then he turned and followed his men out the door. The thundering of hooves receded down the street, leaving behind a thick silence, the smell of gunpowder and the suffocating dust of their departure. Mr. Abernathy slumped against the counter, his face ashen. The woman was sobbing quietly. But Chelsea couldn't move. The stolen money was a distant concern. They had taken the photograph. They had taken her father's watch. This wasn't a robbery. It was a desecration. It was personal. The aftermath of the robbery draped itself over Redemption Valley like a shroud. The sun beat down, but a chill had settled in the town's bones. Folks peered from behind drawn curtains, their faces weary and shadowed with a new kind of fear. The scent of hot leather and horse sweat from the sheriff's posse mingled with the lingering odor of discharged black powder, creating a perfume of violation. Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut hung over his gun belt like a sack of grain, was overwhelmed, his questions circling back on themselves with weary repetition. Chelsea stood outside the bank, the chaotic energy of the posse swirling around her. Her hands trembled, a delayed reaction to the terror, but her voice was steady as she gave orders to Leonidas, her foreman. "Leo, take the boys, and ride the west fence line. Make sure none of this commotion spooks the herd. I want a full count by sundown. Leonidas, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and time, nodded, his expression grim. Yes, ma'am. You sure you're all right? I'm fine, she said, the lie tasting like ash. Her hand went instinctively to her purse, her fingers closing around the empty space, where the familiar weight of her father's watch should have been. The loss was a physical ache, a hollowed-out feeling in the center of her chest. That watch, with its intricate engraving of a running stallion, had been her one tangible connection to the gentle, strong man who had taught her everything about this land. A smooth, polished voice cut through the noise. Chelsea, my dear, what a terrible ordeal. Zane Banks stepped toward her, his tailored suit immaculate despite the dust, his handsome face a mask of deep concern. He was the son of the valley's most successful merchant, a man who had built an empire on leather goods and shrewd investments. He moved with an air of ownership, as if the whole town were his private drawing room. He placed a comforting hand on her arm, but the touch felt cold, proprietary. I've spoken to Sheriff Brody. I've offered him my full support, of course. Anything he needs, Men Resources is at his disposal to bring these animals to justice. That's very generous of you, Zane, Chelsea said, subtly pulling her arm away. His eyes, a pale, calculating green, lingered on her a moment too long. There was something in his gaze that went beyond sympathy. It was an unnerving intensity, an appraisal. A town needs order, he said, his voice dropping. And its people need protection. Especially a woman managing a concern as large as yours all on her own. He made it sound like a failing on her part, a weakness waiting to be exploited. As Banks turned to offer more unsolicited advice to the sheriff, another figure approached Chelsea, moving with a quiet economy that was the polar opposite of Banks's polished swagger. Dalton Hancock, one of her ranch hands, stopped a few feet away, his hat held respectfully in his hands. He was a man of few words, his presence steady and unassuming, but his eyes missed nothing. While others had been shouting and panicking, Chelsea had noticed him near the hitching posts, his gaze fixed on the ground. Mrs. Goodwin, he said, his voice low and calm. I didn't want to trouble the sheriff while he's occupied. He gestured with his chin toward the churned-up dirt where the robbers' horses had stood. One of them was riding a horse with a clipped shoe on the right forefoot. Leaves a broken C shape in the print? It's distinctive. Might be worth remembering. Chelsea stared at him. In the midst of the mayhem, while the sheriff and his men were looking for witnesses and grand clues, Dalton had noticed a detail in the dust, a small, practical fact that could actually mean something. She saw the other hands glancing at him with a mixture of confusion and respect. He was just a hired hand, yet he was the only one who had offered a piece of tangible evidence. Thank you, Dalton, she said, the words feeling inadequate. I'll make sure the sheriff knows. He simply nodded, his gaze clear and direct, then melted back into the crowd of onlookers, his quiet competence a small, solid rock in the swirling tide of chaos. As Chelsea watched him go, a cold certainty settled over her. The stolen photograph, her father's watch, Banks's predatory concern, and a horseshoe print in the dust, they were all pieces of a puzzle she didn't yet understand. But she knew with the instinct of a rancher who can smell a storm on the wind that the robbery was not the end of her trouble. It was just the beginning. It was just... A week passed. The dust settled, but the unease remained a low hum beneath the surface of daily life in Redemption Valley. The sheriff's posse had returned empty-handed, their search dissolving into the vast, indifferent landscape of the territories. The stolen money was written off, the robbers dismissed as just another band of opportunistic drifters. But Chelsea knew better. She felt watched. The feeling was a constant prickle on the back of her neck as she rode her own land, a shadow that flickered at the edge of her vision. The shadow took on a name and a face one blistering afternoon when Zane Banks rode up to the Double M ranch house. He wasn't on his usual manicured town horse, but a powerful black stallion that seemed to exude the same arrogant energy as its rider. He dismounted without waiting for an invitation, his polished boots leaving sharp impressions in the dry yard. Chelsea met him on the porch, her arms crossed, the simple gesture a barrier against his intrusion. "Zane, I'm busy." "We all are, Chelsea." "Busy trying to survive," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. He bypassed her and walked into the parlor as if he had been invited, running a gloved hand over the worn velvet of her mother's settee. "I've come to you with a proposition, a way to ensure your survival." He turned to face her, his expression shifting from feigned friendliness to cold, hard business. "I want to buy your ranch." The offer hung in the air between them, stark and offensive. "The Double M is not for sale." Chelsea said, her voice flat. "Everything is for sale, my dear, for the right price. I'm prepared to be more than generous. I'll pay you 50% above its appraised value, a fortune that would allow you to live comfortably in Denver or even back east, away from all this." He gestured vaguely at the vast expanse of land, visible through the window, his tone laced with contempt. "This land was my father's. It will be my children's should I have any. It is not for sale." Banks sighed, a theatrical display of disappointment. "I thought you were a practical woman. That land you cherish is becoming more valuable by the day. The railroad needs its easement, as you know. An easement I could negotiate far more effectively than a lone woman." "I've handled the railroad negotiations just fine on my own," she countered. It was then that his polite facade cracked, peeling away to reveal something ugly beneath. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing pitch. "Have you, or have you simply been lucky last week's events at the bank should serve as a stark reminder of how vulnerable you are? You need protection, Chelsea. The kind of protection my name, my influence can provide." The word protection was layered with threat. It was the same word he had used after the robbery. This wasn't a suitor's plea or a businessman's offer. It was an ultimatum. She stood her ground, refusing to let him see the fear that was beginning to coil in her stomach. "I don't respond well to threats, Zane." His laugh was a short, sharp bark devoid of humor. "It's not a threat. It's a statement of fact. It's a dangerous world for a woman alone. Fortunes can turn as fast as the weather in these parts." He walked to the door, pausing on the threshold to look back at her, his green eyes glittering like shards of broken glass. "My offer stands for 1 week. I suggest you think very carefully about your future." As he rode away, leaving a plume of dust to hang in the still hot air, Chelsea understood. The bank robbery hadn't been about money or even about the sentimental items they'd taken. It was a message, a demonstration of her vulnerability, orchestrated by the very man now offering to save her from it. The fight for the Double M wasn't about cattle or railroad easements anymore. It was about survival, and she had just been declared the enemy in a war she didn't even know she was fighting. Banks didn't wait a week. His campaign of intimidation began 2 nights later, silent and insidious. It started at the northern pasture, where a creek fed by a mountain spring provided the clearest, most reliable water for miles. Leonidas found the first dead steer at dawn, its body bloated near the water's edge. By noon, they had found 3 more. The water itself, usually crystal clear, had a faint, oily sheen and smelled faintly of chemicals. "This ain't the work of nature." Leonidas said, his voice a low growl of fury. He knelt by the creek, his weathered face grim. "We've faced droughts and blizzards, Mrs. Goodwin. We'll face this too. But this is the work of a snake. Chelsea stood beside him, a cold knot of anger tightening in her gut. She gave the orders crisply, her voice sharp and authoritative, a shield against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Get the herd moved to the south pasture immediately. Post a guard on the well there, 2 men around the clock. I want every water source on this property checked before another animal drinks from it. As the hands scattered to follow her commands, their panicked chatter, a nervous buzz in the air. Dalton Hancock approached the poisoned creek. He didn't join the speculation. He knelt, scooping a handful of dirt from the bank, crumbling it between his fingers, sniffing it. He walked the perimeter, his eyes scanning the ground. Whoever did this knew where to strike. He said to Chelsea, his voice quiet but resonant. They hit our best water source, the one furthest from the bunkhouse. Knew our rotation. They're watching us. His words were concise, practical, and carried the weight of chilling certainty. They cut through the noise, confirming what Chelsea already suspected. This was a calculated attack, not a random act of malice. His insight forged a silent bond between them. In the frantic days that followed, while Leonidas managed the men and the herd, Chelsea found herself turning to Dalton. His quiet observations were more valuable than the loud opinions of a dozen other men. The next attack came 4 days later. A 100-yard section of fence along the western ridge was cut, the wires snipped cleanly in a dozen places. The resulting stampede was small, thanks to the quick work of the night watch. But they lost a prize bull and a half-dozen heifers before they could contain the chaos. The financial loss was significant, but the psychological blow was worse. The Double M was no longer a sanctuary. It was a besieged fortress. That night, Chelsea found Leonidas on the porch of the main house, staring out into the oppressive darkness. His shoulders were slumped with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "He's trying to break us, Leo," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "He's trying to break you." The old foreman corrected his voice, rough with emotion. "This ranch. It's been my life since your father first hired me as a boy. We buried your parents from this house. We watched you grow up. We're not going to let some slick-haired town bully take it." Her own vulnerability, which she kept so tightly locked away during the day, surfaced in the safety of the night. What if I can't stop him? What if I'm not strong enough? "Strength ain't about never being scared, Chelsea," he said, turning to face her. "It's about what you do when you are. Your father knew that. You got his blood in you. Don't you ever forget it." Later, as she was poring over maps of the ranch in her father's study, trying to anticipate the next strike, Dalton appeared at the door. "Beg pardon, Mrs. Goodwin," he said, holding a small, twisted piece of metal. "Found this near the cut fence line. It's a wire clipping tool. Looks brand new. Not the kind we use? Ours are old worn." She took the tool. It was heavy efficient. Store-bought. Not something a common drifter would carry. It was the tool of someone who had planned this, someone with resources. "They're not just watching," she said, more to herself than to him. "No, ma'am," Dalton replied, his gaze steady. "They're organized, but so are we." His simple, confident statement was a lifeline. He didn't offer empty reassurances or platitudes. He spoke of we, a partnership forged in crisis. In his concise, practical way, he was telling her she wasn't alone in this fight. And for the first time since Banks had made his threat, Chelsea felt a flicker of something other than fear defiance. The campaign of intimidation forced Chelsea's hand. Waiting for the next attack was a fool's game. She had to fight back. But a direct confrontation with a man as powerful as Zane Banks was suicide. She needed proof, something more than suspicions and poisoned water. The investigation began quietly, with Chelsea and Dalton riding into Redemption Valley under the guise of buying supplies. The town felt different. Eyes followed them down the main street. Whispers ceased when they drew near. Banks had already begun poisoning the well of public opinion. Their first stop was the Mercantile. While Chelsea purchased salt and flour, Dalton struck up a conversation with a freight driver unloading a wagon. He spoke of hard times of ranchers struggling to make ends meet. The driver, loosened by the shared complaint, mentioned that Zane Banks had been a veritable saint, buying up loan papers from the bank for ranchers on the verge of foreclosure. "Given him a second chance," he is the man said with admiration. But Chelsea knew Banks didn't have a charitable bone in his body. He wasn't offering a second chance. He was collecting leverage, tightening his grip on the valley one desperate rancher at a time. Their next stop was the saloon on the edge of town, a grimy establishment known for cheap whiskey and discreet business. It was a place frequented by the kind of men who worked for wages and asked no questions. Pleading a headache, Chelsea sent Dalton in alone while she waited across the street. He emerged 20 minutes later, his face impassive. The stable boy was talkative, he reported in a low voice as they walked away. "Recognized my description of the horseshoe print. Said a fella who works for Banks a hard case named Jed rides a bay with a clipped shoe just like it. Keeps his horses here, not at Banks's main stable." The pieces were clicking into place. Jed, one of Banks's paid men. It was the first concrete link between the intimidation and Banks himself. But it still wasn't enough. A stable boy's word against Zane Banks was nothing. That evening, back at the Double M, an idea began to form in Chelsea's mind, a desperate long shot born from a memory. Her late husband, Kel, for all his cruelty, had been meticulous. He kept records of everything. After his death, she had packed his office belongings into crates and stored them in the attic, unwilling to deal with the painful memories they held. But Kel had been the son of a banker, a man who understood debt and leverage. And he had been deeply involved with Zane Banks's father. "I need to search Kel's old office," she told Dalton, the words tasting like rust. Together, they hauled the dusty crates down from the attic. The room still smelled faintly of Kel's expensive cigars and the pomade he used on his hair. It was like opening a tomb. Chelsea's hands trembled as she sorted through financial records, land deeds, and correspondence. It was a meticulous record of a life she had been forced to share, but had never truly been a part of. For hours, they found nothing but standard business dealings. Then, in the bottom of a crate filled with old bank statements, Dalton's hand brushed against a false bottom. He pried it open with his knife. Inside lay a single slim volume, a private ledger, bound in dark green leather. Chelsea opened it. Kel's precise, elegant script filled the pages. Her breath caught. It wasn't a record of ranch business. It was a detailed accounting of a single, massive debt. Column after column listed payments, interest accruals, and terse notes. The creditor listed at the top of every page was Elias Banks Zane's father. The truth, when it came, was a cold, brutal shock. Her first husband, Kel Goodwin, had been secretly and catastrophically in debt to the Banks family. The numbers were staggering, a sum that would have bankrupted the Double M twice over. The final entry was dated 1 week before her own wedding to Kel. It didn't list a monetary payment. Instead, it read, "Debt settled in full per agreement, re McMillan land and marriage contract." It all made a sickening kind of sense. Her marriage hadn't been about securing the railroad easement. That was just a convenient excuse. It had been a desperate secret bargain. Her father, likely unaware of the full extent of Kel's financial ruin, had agreed to the match to secure his daughter's future. But Kel had used her and her inheritance as collateral to save himself from disgrace. She had been sold, a bride traded to settle a hidden debt. The threat from Zane Banks was no longer just about land. It was a continuation of a dark legacy, a claim he felt was his, by right, rooted in the secrets and lies of her own past. She looked at Dalton, the ledger open in her trembling hands, and saw in his eyes not pity, but a shared resolve. The fight had just become infinitely more personal. The discovery of Kell's ledger was a key, but it unlocked a room far darker than they had imagined. Armed with the names and dates from the ledger, Chelsea and Dalton returned to town, this time to the offices of the Redemption Valley Gazette. They spent an afternoon scrolling through years of back issues on a rattling microfiche reader, the stale air of the archives thick with the ghosts of old news. They were looking for any record of the financial dealings between the Goodwins and the Bankses. But what they found was something else entirely. It was a small article buried on the third page of an issue from 20 years prior, dated 1863. The headline was "Mundane County Court Resolves Land Dispute." But the names made Chelsea's blood run cold. The article detailed a bitter, year-long legal battle over water rights and property lines between two of the valley's founding ranchers, Thomas McMillan, her father, and Elias Banks, Zane's father. According to the report, the court had ruled decisively in her father's favor, granting the McMillans sole access to the spring-fed creek that demarcated their properties. The ruling had effectively crippled the Banks ranch, rendering their prime grazing land arid and nearly worthless. A follow-up article published 2 months later was even more chilling. It was a brief, somber notice, reporting that Elias Banks, facing financial ruin and the loss of his family's legacy, had taken his own life in the barn of his failing ranch. He left behind a wife and a young son, Zane. Everything shifted. The world tilted on its axis, and every event of the past few weeks reconfigured itself into a new, terrifying picture. This wasn't about a railroad easement. It wasn't about an old debt Kell owed. This was older, deeper, a wound left to fester for 2 decades. Zane Banks was not just a greedy, opportunistic businessman. He was the son of a ruined man, consumed by a generational vendetta. He didn't just want her land. He wanted to destroy her, to dismantle her father's legacy piece by piece, just as he believed Thomas McMillan had dismantled his. The stolen photograph of her parents wasn't a random trophy. It was a symbol of the family he blamed for his father's suicide. The pocket watch was another piece of the man he was sworn to destroy. His obsession wasn't with her future. It was with her past. "He's not trying to buy the ranch," Chelsea whispered, her hands gripping the edge of the viewing machine. "He's trying to reclaim what he thinks is his. He's exacting revenge." The cold, calculated cruelty of the poisoned wells, the cut fences, it was all part of a systematic plan to inflict upon her the same slow, agonizing ruin that had destroyed his own family. He was reenacting his father's downfall with her cast in the leading role. The fight was no longer a matter of business or intimidation. It had become a deeply personal war, a battle against a ghost from a past she never even knew existed. She wasn't just fighting for her land anymore. She was fighting for her father's name, her family's honor, and her very life against a man whose entire existence was fueled by hate. The revelation of Zane's vendetta changed the very air they breathed. Every shadow now seemed to hold a specific menace. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper of the past. Knowing she was getting closer to the truth, Banks escalated his campaign from sabotage to outright destruction of her life, aiming to isolate and cripple her beyond recovery. He struck not at her cattle or her fences, but at the one person she had come to trust. Sheriff Brody and 2 deputies rode up to the Double M at midday, their expressions a mixture of grim duty and embarrassment. Chelsea met them on the porch, Dalton at her side. "Mrs. Goodwin," Hancock the sheriff corrected himself awkwardly. "I have a warrant for the arrest of Dalton Hancock." Chelsea's heart stopped. On what charge? Bank robbery. The accusation was so ludicrous, so utterly baseless, that she almost laughed. But the look on Brody's face was deadly serious. Sheriff, that's insane. Dalton was with me that entire day. I have a witness who says otherwise, Brody said, refusing to meet her eyes. And we have this. He held up a cloth bag. With a sickening sense of dread, Chelsea watched as he tipped its contents into his palm. Her father's gold pocket watch glittered in the sun. We found it in his bunk during a search, one of the deputies mumbled, gesturing toward the bunkhouse. It was a perfect diabolical trap. Banks had used one of his paid men, likely Jed the man with the distinctive horse, to plant the watch, the one piece of stolen property that could be definitively traced back to the robbery. The sheriff, already indebted to Banks through loans he held on the man's property, had no choice but to act on the evidence. "This is a lie," Dalton said, his voice dangerously calm. He didn't struggle or protest his innocence. He simply looked at Chelsea, his eyes conveying a single, urgent message: stay strong. They put him in irons. The metallic rasp of the cuffs, locking around his wrists, was the ugliest sound that Chelsea had ever heard. As they led him away, a small crowd of ranch hands gathered, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. Banks's poison had reached her own people. Doubt was a seed, and he had just planted it right in her yard. Chelsea was now utterly alone. The one man she trusted was in jail, framed for a crime he didn't commit. The town, already primed by Banks's whispers, turned against her completely. Rumors, vile and insidious, spread like wildfire. She was the disgraced widow who had taken up with a criminal lover. People crossed the street to avoid her. The mercantile owner suddenly found himself short on the specific brand of flour she always bought. The blacksmith was too busy to reshoe her horses. Banks had successfully cut her off from the community, isolating her on her own land. He had taken her ally, tarnished her name, and surrounded her with suspicion. She was no longer just fighting for the Double M. She was now fighting for Dalton's life, for his freedom, and for the very soul of her own reputation, against an enemy who seemed to have anticipated her every move. The weight of it all was crushing, but as she watched the dust settle on the road where they had taken Dalton, the fear inside her began to burn away, forged by the heat of her rage into something hard and sharp, a weapon. The first step was to free Dalton. A frontal assault on the sheriff was useless. Brody was trapped in Banks's web. Chelsea needed to break one of the strands. She needed to turn one of Banks's own men. Her target was Jed, the hard case rider with the telltale horse. She found him 2 nights later at the saloon, drinking away his wages. He was a man with cruel eyes and a weak chin, the kind of bully who mistakes fear for respect. She didn't confront him with accusations. She used the one weapon Banks couldn't control: money. She cornered him in the alley behind the saloon, the stench of stale beer and desperation thick in the air. "The sheriff knows about the horse with the clipped shoe," she said, her voice low and steady. "He knows it was you at the bank." Jed's hand went to the pistol on his hip. "You're lying." "Am I?" she pressed. "Banks isn't going to protect you, Jed. When this all comes out, who do you think he's going to blame? The wealthy, respected businessman or the hired thug with a record as long as your arm? He's going to feed you to the wolves to save himself." She let that sink in, then played her card. She tossed a heavy leather pouch onto a nearby rain barrel. It landed with a satisfying clink of coin. "That's $500. More than Banks will pay you in a year. All you have to do is sign a statement telling the truth about who hired you for the robbery and who told you to plant the watch. You sign it, take the money, and ride out of this territory tonight. Or you can stay and wait for the marshal to hang you." She saw the war in his eyes, fear against greed. Greed won. With Jed's signed confession in hand, Chelsea didn't go to the sheriff. She went straight to Judge Miller, an old impartial circuit judge who distrusted the influence of men like Banks. The confession combined with the ledger proving the long-standing financial entanglement was enough. The judge issued an order for Dalton's immediate release. But Chelsea knew this small victory was just a reprieve. Banks would not be defeated in a courtroom. This had to end where it began. She sent a message to Banks, a simple 4-word note delivered by a ranch boy, the old Banks homestead. Sunset. She knew his pride and his obsession would not allow him to refuse. She rode out alone, the setting sun at her back, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. On the horizon, a dark wall of clouds was building the promise of a fierce dust storm. The abandoned Banks homestead was a skeleton on the prairie, a decaying monument to a forgotten tragedy. The house sagged its windows like vacant eyes. The barn had long since collapsed into a pile of weathered timber. This was the place where Zane's world had ended, and it was where she would end his war. She found him inside the house, standing in the center of what was once the parlor. Dust motes danced in the slivers of fading light, slanting through the boarded-up windows. The air was thick with the smell of decay and regret. A fierce wind began to howl outside, rattling the loose shutters, a rising overture to the storm. "You've been busy," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "The truth has a way of coming out, Zane." His laugh was a dry, rasping sound. "Truth. You have no idea what the truth is." He began to pace the wind, shrieking around the house, trapping them together in the claustrophobic, dust-choked room. "My father built this place with his bare hands. He poured his life into that land. And your father, with his lawyers and his righteous speeches, took it all away. He bled him dry over a trickle of water. He destroyed him." His voice dripped with the venom of a 20-year-old wound. He smiled at my father in town, tipped his hat while behind his back he was methodically ruining him. When it was over, when we had nothing left, my father came back to this house, walked into that barn, and ended it. Do you know what that's like, Chelsea? To find your own father hanging from a rafter, to know that the man everyone in town calls a saint is the reason for it. He confessed everything, his rage a torrent that matched the rising storm. The bank robbery, the stolen mementos, the poisoned wells, as it was all part of his life's work, a meticulous recreation of his family's suffering. Then he smiled, a terrible, triumphant expression. He reached into his coat and produced the secondary twist, the final brutal weapon in his arsenal. It was a legally binding document, yellowed with age, bearing Kel Goodwin's signature. "Your first husband was a weak, foolish man, but he was useful," Banks spat. "He owed my father a fortune. Just before his convenient death, he signed this. It deeds the eastern third of the Double M Ranch, the part with the water rights, the part my father lost to me to settle the old family debt upon his death. The fire that killed him was a happy accident, I assure you. But this," he brandished the paper like a sword. "This is perfectly legal. You may have clever tricks, but I have the law. I will take back what is mine, and I will enjoy watching you lose everything just like he did." In that moment, he lunged not with a gun, but with his bare hands, his face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. His obsession had finally consumed him. But he never reached her. A shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom of the doorway. Dalton. He had tracked her, had followed her into the heart of the storm. He moved with swift, brutal efficiency, intercepting Banks's charge. The fight was a desperate, thrashing struggle in the swirling dust and fading light. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a battle of wills made physical. Dalton, stronger and more centered, subdued Banks, forcing him to the floor just as the main door burst open. Sheriff Brody stood there, his gun drawn. Jed's signed confession clutched in his other hand. Finally convinced, finally free of Banks's influence, he had come to make the right arrest. The storm outside reached its crescendo, and in the heart of that maelstrom, The war was finally over. As the dust storm abated, leaving the air clean and the world washed, new Zane Banks was taken into custody. The town, which had so recently whispered against Chelsea, was now abuzz with the shocking news of his downfall, with the story of his generational vendetta spreading faster than any rumor he had ever started. The legal document he had held as his final weapon was examined by Judge Miller. It was, as Banks had claimed, technically valid. But Chelsea, using the hidden ledger she had found, presented irrefutable proof that Kell had signed it under extreme duress. The ledger, cross-referenced with the timeline of Banks's systematic intimidation, painted a clear picture of extortion. The judge declared the contract null and void, severed by the poisoned root from which it had grown. The ride back to the Double M was silent. Chelsea and Dalton were bone-weary, the physical and emotional toll of the confrontation settling deep into their muscles. The ranch, when it came into view, looked like a sanctuary, solid and enduring against the bruised twilight sky. They didn't speak. There was no need. They walked onto the porch, the floorboards groaning a familiar welcome, and stood side by side watching the first pale fingers of dawn stretch over the mountains. The sunrise was a slow, quiet promise, a symbolic end to the long, dark night of their struggle. There was no grand romantic declaration, no passionate embrace. There was only a shared, silent understanding that they had weathered the storm, all of it together. It was an understanding that ran deeper than words, a partnership forged in fire and sealed in the quiet peace of a new day. In that shared silence, looking out over the land that was finally truly safe, a new foundation was settled, solid and unshakable. Months later, a new normal had taken root at the Double M. The rhythms of ranch life, the bawling of calves in the spring, the long hot days of the summer drive, the crisp scent of autumn hay, were a comforting balm. The ranch was not just surviving, it was thriving. Under the joint leadership of Chelsea and Dalton, it became a model of efficiency and resilience. Chelsea, no longer the reclusive widow or the subject of gossip, had stepped fully into her role as a respected leader in the community, her name synonymous not with scandal, but with strength. Dalton, no longer just a hired hand, was her official partner in every sense of the word. Their wedding was not a grand town affair. It was a quiet private ceremony, held on a bright October morning on the ranch under the shade of the ancient cottonwood tree by the creek. Leonidas stood as Dalton's witness, his wife Anna beside Chelsea. The only other guests were a few of the most loyal handsmen who had stood by them through the darkest days. Their vows, spoken in the clear, still air, were not the flowery promises of poets, but the solid, grounded pledges of partners. "I promise to trust you, to work beside you, and to build with you." Chelsea said, her eyes locked on his. "I promise to honor that trust, to protect what we build, and to be the partner you deserve." Dalton replied, his voice steady and sure. The final scene of their struggle played out not with words, but with a quiet, symbolic act. A few weeks after their wedding, a small package arrived from the U.S. Marshal's office. Inside, nestled in cotton, were the recovered items from the bank robbery. The pocket watch which Chelsea gave to Dalton, and the small, silver-framed photograph of her parents. That evening, Chelsea took the photo into the parlor. She polished the intricate silver frame until it shone, her thumb tracing the smiling faces of the man and woman who had given her this legacy. For a long moment, she looked at it, honoring the past and the love that had created her. Then she placed it on the center of the mantelpiece. Beside it, she set a new photograph in a simple hand-carved wooden frame Dalton had made. It was a picture of the two of them taken on their wedding day, standing on the porch, looking not at the camera, but at each other. The act was a quiet declaration: the past was honored, but the future was their own, to build. She joined Dalton on the porch, the cool evening air, a gentle caress. They stood together, looking out over the valley as the stars began to appear in the vast, dark sky. The land before them was no longer just an inheritance to be protected from ghosts and greed. It was a future waiting to be written, a testament to the hard-won peace they had built together.